Hello and welcome to The Value of Others, Part 15. Cigar, coffee. The Value of Others by Orion Taraban. Chapter 8. There is no happily ever after. Over the previous several chapters, we've examined the first two phases of relationships, attraction and negotiation. As discussed, we can imagine the sexual marketplace to be a bustling dock with crowds of passengers trying to voyage forth on ships of all sizes. A certain vessel might catch a passenger's eye. The captain notices a face in the crowd. That's attraction. The passenger then explores the cabin and examines the itinerary. The captain performs a security check and explains the operation of the ship. Both attempts to secure the best possible deal for themselves, and they consent to transact unequal goods of comparable value. That's negotiation. If the two reach an agreement, the interaction ends with the passenger climbing on aboard and the ship sailing off into the sunset. The end. Of course, not really. If anything, a relationship only begins once it leaves the dock, and there are many dangers that await on the high seas. Unfortunately, the lion's share of dating advice restricts itself to the attraction and negotiation phases of relationships. And while this isn't exactly unexpected, after all, captains and passengers need to have overcome a number of challenges just to arrive at the maintenance phase, which means that fewer people will be found further down the relationship pipeline. It does tend to leave people unprepared for their own success. The truth is that there is no happily ever after. When you're out on the open seas, you spend every day staying above water. A ship never gets to not float. The literary definition of a comedy is any story that ends in marriage. My definition of a tragedy is any story that continues past that point. Indeed, the main difference between these two apparently diametrically opposed genres is where the story stops. Consider the ending of that modern masterpiece of dark comedy, Mike Nichols' The Graduate. We've just witnessed this incredible display of romantic ardor. Ben interrupts Elaine's wedding, and the two fight their way out of the church, then flag down the first passing bus going who knows where. Who cares, as long as we're together? In the penultimate shot of the film, the two lovebirds are sitting in the back of the bus, absolutely giddy over what they just did. Can you believe it? Love wins in the end. What a triumph of passion and hope. Hurrah! If this film were a straight comedy, it would end at this exact moment, so that all the spectators could leave the theatre a little lighter for having partaken vicariously in the romantic victory. The genius of the film is that the camera holds this last shot longer than it should. We see the giddiness of Florence wane and give way to a growing, panicked realization. What the hell just happened? Where is this bus even going? What are we going to do? As the bus rolls out of sight, like a ship sailing toward the horizon, we can hardly feel confident in the success of their venture. If they don't end up in paradise, they may just make it to their just deserts. The maintenance phase of any relationship begins as soon as the ship sets sail and lasts as long as it stays afloat. Of the three phases, it receives the least amount of attention in the popular imagination, but it may well be the most important. After all, why bother conquering a kingdom if you can't hold it afterwards? Since the maintenance phase typically dwarfs the other two in terms of duration, much could be said about it. In the interest of time, however, I'll resign myself to addressing the three most significant crises that folks tend to encounter out on the open seas, and of course, I will discuss how each might be successfully navigated. Let's attend to these crises in the sequence in which they typically present in relationships. Move to the shade. At the water's edge. The first major crisis of the maintenance phase is what I call the crisis of disillusionment. This crisis generally occurs about 6 months into a burgeoning relationship. If you're the type of person who gets into relationships quickly but has difficulty keeping them past this point, then you're probably floundering on this shore. Attraction always precedes negotiation and maintenance because without attraction, there is significantly less emotional motivation to invest the time, energy, and resources necessary to advance to the other relationship phases. Attraction is fuel. You need it to go places. A commitment without attraction is simply an obligation, and people tend to have a difficult time discharging obligation indefinitely. So, at least, some degree of attraction, and usually much more than that, seems required for a successful outcome. Unfortunately, attraction is always distortive, and the greater the attraction, the more significant the distortion. Combine this fact with the reality that most people today are dating strangers, people they match with on dating apps, people they pick up as they move through life. And we can easily conclude that, in the vast majority of cases, attraction is not based on accurate knowledge of the other. The decision to like someone almost always precedes the rational basis for that liking. This is why no one can ever explain their attraction. What do you see in him/her? Any characteristics you could possibly name. He's tall and strong and handsome, she's cute and sweet and kind, are characteristics shared by literally millions of other human beings, people to whom you are presumably not as strongly attracted. These attempts at explanation are not reasons why someone became attracted as much as they are rationalizations to defend an attraction that already existed. It may not be satisfying, but the most truthful answer to this question is something like, I like him/her because I do. This confirms what everyone already understands about attraction, that it is not experienced as a choice. Indeed, as we've seen, it's based on certain biologically determined and culturally informed factors, over which the individual has little to no control. Furthermore, the idiosyncratic valuation algorithms that calculate the perception of value are largely inaccessible in the unconscious minds of the individuals in question. People can choose whether and how to act on that attraction, but they can't choose whether or how much they feel that attraction. In fact, most people have even had the experience of feeling attracted to someone to whom, for whatever reason they didn't want to feel attracted. Attraction can be a capricious imp. In any case, if attraction isn't based on accurate knowledge of the other, then it can't be true, at least in the beginning, that people are attracted to the other person. After all, at this stage, they don't know who the other person is. What people are actually attracted to are certain projected components of their own minds, namely, idealized fantasies of who they want the other person to be. This is very important, so allow me to explain it in more detail. Nature abhors a vacuum. This is Nature abhors a vacuum. This is as true psychologically as it is physically. Whether or not they want to, people unconsciously fill in the gaps in their knowledge bases with what they expect to find there. And what they expect to find there is largely determined by their current emotional state. For example, when people are afraid, they fill in their knowledge gaps with pessimistic projections and worst-case scenarios. By the same token, when people are attracted, they fill it in those same gaps with hopeful projections and positive attributes. This is an example of the halo effect, in which people unconsciously attribute positive personality traits to those to whom they are attracted. Statistically speaking, it's unlikely that the beautiful woman you just met is also funny and charming and intelligent and kind. And in any case, you can't possibly have enough data to support those conclusions at this point. It's safer to assume these are projected fantasies generated by the initial attraction. You want her, and so your mind increasingly transforms her into someone you want to want. And since seeing what they want to see only increases attraction, people can easily get carried away by the resulting positive feedback loop. This is why romantic love has appropriately been accused of being narcissistic, in the myth from which the term is derived. Narcissus falls in love with his own reflection when he sits down to rest at the edge of a pond. When his longing is sufficiently inflamed, he reaches out to embrace the other and drowns. Most people incorrectly believe that narcissism is always the aggrandizing love of self as self. In fact, narcissism is more commonly the aggrandizing love of other as self. Like Narcissus, the romantic lover tends to fall in love with his or her reflection, except in this case, the projected surface isn't water, it's another human being. These people aren't engaging with another person as much as they are interacting with the reflected projection of their own fantasies. Romantics fall in love with themselves, though this is not how they experience this phenomenon in their own subjectivity. Of course, just like the myth, this infatuation is both unsustainable and tragic. To emphasize, to paraphrase Ayn Rand, though people can avoid reality, they can't avoid the consequences of avoiding reality. And these consequences tend to build up over time until they reach the point at which the fantasies can no longer support the weight of the disconfirming evidence. Whether this threshold is reached by a single large betrayal or an accumulation of many small disappointments is irrelevant. Over a long enough timeline, all lovers eventually arrive at this point, and when they can no longer turn a blind eye to the amassed counterfactual evidence, the fantasy upon which their attraction is largely based shatters and falls apart. This is the crisis of disillusionment. Though their partners are the same people they were yesterday, they will look and feel completely different, and how could they not? Reality has sufficiently intruded on their fantasies, which were primarily responsible for their infatuation. It's difficult to keep dreaming when you know you're awake, even if their partners are wonderful and desirable people in reality. This experience can't fail to lower attraction because, irrespective of how good they are, no one can measure up to the personalized, idealized version of who you want them to be. So those who pass through this crisis may not only experience significant reductions in their desire and attraction, but they can feel panicked or cheated as well. They won't quite know what happened, but they definitely won't feel the same way anymore. They may even believe that they've fallen out of love. This experience is particularly devastating for those who are chasing the spark. Millions of people, especially among the young and inexperienced, use the feeling of being in love, or limerence, as the primary means of measuring the value of any given relationship. They seek it out consciously and intentionally. However, since they generally don't understand what this experience is and how it is created, spark chasers often navigate the sexual marketplace like particles in Brownian motion, caroming about in apparent randomness. Such individuals can struggle inordinately with the crisis of disillusionment. Like addicts, they can bounce from one short-term relationship to the next, looking for their next hit. The high they're chasing doesn't come from a substance, rather it's the endogenous chemicals released by their own reward circuitry that are responsible. In its extreme forms, this can become a process addiction akin to gambling or gaming disorders. However, even those who experience a more attenuated crisis will at least pause at this point of the relationship. To some degree or another, our partners aren't who we thought they were, and we're likely not too committed or invested at this stage of the game. Should we abandon ship before we completely lose sight of the shore? As disappointing as it may feel, this might be the wisest course of action. Or is there enough left in reality to justify and maintain the relationship? Regardless of how long the courtship has progressed, this is the moment when the relationship actually begins. Up until this point, both parties were more or less interacting with their own projected fantasies. The collapse of these fantasies is precisely the opportunity to begin engaging with the other in reality. Is this someone I can actually love? Do we really have what it takes to go the distance, to be useful? These questions must be answered soberly and with accurate self-knowledge. Since relationships can only be negotiated prudently when attraction is within certain limits, high enough to motivate action but low enough to minimize distortion, it's generally a good idea for people to table any significant decisions regarding commitment and investment until they have successfully resolved this crisis. This often takes longer than most people would like. However, the cost of impatience can be quite high. A string of unstable relationships characterized by a fair amount of chaos. No one will ever be as good as you want them to be, but with a little luck, they may be good enough for the voyage you have planned. In general, the crisis of disillusionment becomes less disruptive with experience. If you already have a few relationships under your belt, if you're experienced if you've experienced heartbreak and potentially broken a heart yourself, and if you have a clear idea of who you really are as opposed to who you think you are and who you should be or who you want to be, then you will likely set sail on any new relationship with tempered expectations. Projection is always an unconscious process, and it may be unavoidable to some degree, but the more fully you understand and accept yourself, and the more firmly you keep your feet on the ground, the less susceptible you will be to this particular enchantment. However, this kind of maturity is usually only gained through time and pain. Can people do anything to minimize the impact of this crisis without going through the whinging ringer? It turns out there are two relatively easy ways to do so. First, I encourage people not to date. I appreciate that this sounds pretty weird on the surface. How else are people going to collect the information they need to make a reality-based decision with respect to a prospective partner? In the absence of dating, wouldn't people just skip straight to commitment? Not necessarily, and I wouldn't recommend that. In any case, what I'm suggesting is that people forego the activities we typically associate with dating in favor of other types of interactions, which ideally should more closely approximate the actual relationship the players aspire to have. Most dating activities fall into two general categories. Either they are fun and frivolous, getting drinks, going dancing, playing mini-golf, or they are luxurious and romantic, fine dining, sumptuous settings, weekend getaways. Since most dates are planned by men, and since men attempt to exchange resources for sexual opportunity, men select these activities because they presumably increase the likelihood that such an opportunity will arise, albeit through different pathways, namely playful stimulation on the one hand and resource validation on the other. That these activities are chosen primarily for their ability to induce a sexual encounter can easily be seen by contrasting them with the date many women suggest for an initial interaction, meeting for coffee. Few activities are less likely to lead to a sexual encounter than drinking caffeine in a brightly lit cafe at 11 a.m., which is precisely why women who are trying to exchange the most resources for the least amount of sexual opportunity are so fond of the idea. So men want to have sex, and they're willing to entertain or impress women in order to make it happen. This is hardly news. In any case, what's the problem with dating is this way. The problem is that if you're like most people, you're not spending your free time at the bowling alley or Michelin star restaurants. The activities that most men choose for dates have almost nothing to do with the lives they actually live, when left to their own devices. As a result, they are training their dates to expect a lifestyle that they will be hard pressed to maintain if and when they succeed in securing a commitment. The amount of bits of grass that are fucking like tickling and scratching my fucking back is taking the piss. Fuck off. I keep thinking it's flies, but I think it is just fucking dead grass. In general, whatever someone does to get a relationship is what someone must do to keep a relationship. Otherwise, players will justly feel as though they transacted under false pretenses. While bait and switch is a viable strategy for those who want to churn through short-term relationships, it's a terrible idea for those looking to remain partners long-term. This approach to dating also significantly exasperates the crisis of disillusionment, as players are intentionally trying to cultivate a fantasy to facilitate the transaction, to the extent that the fantasy is misaligned with the player's actual lifestyles. It becomes increasingly unnecessary and unsustainable once the transaction has been secured. A relaxation of the effort needed to maintain the fantasy often coincides with an abatement of limerance's positive distortion several months into the courtship, which together create a perfect storm. Rather than play activities that have little to do with their actual lives, it's a better idea to date by inviting people into the structures of their pre-existing lifestyles. This is especially true for whoever is occupying the role of the captain, since passengers have a right to inspect the ship before getting on board. Captains should strive to give them an accurate idea of what might be in store for them out at sea. Among other things, this means that captains shouldn't go out of their way for passengers. If captains would otherwise spend the evening at the gym, then they can invite a passenger along for a session. If captains generally make dinner at home, then they can invite a passenger over to help them cook. And if mini golf just so happens to be an important part of captains' lives, then they can invite a passenger out for a round or two. Captains looking for passengers who can successfully assimilate into life on board would do well to invite prospects into their everyday lives and simply go about their business. Doing so will significantly reduce the misalignment between fantasy and reality, which is the primary driver of the crisis of disillusionment. And second, I counsel people not to hide. First impressions are important, and it's good advice to play to your strengths and put your best foot forward. Salesmen should have no qualms about presenting their products in the best possible light. By the same token, however, if you have good reason to believe that something about you that you are either unwilling or unable to change, your true age, your religious beliefs, your political affiliation, your drug use, your children by a previous relationship, your sexual preferences, might be a deal breaker for a non-insignificant portion of the population, then you should find ways to introduce these aspects of yourself into the dynamic fairly early in the process. Many are loath to do this, as it can realistically lead to the end of a relationship, but the alternative is to either hide indefinitely or risk termination after the investment of considerable time, energy, and money. It's a good idea not to lead with this information, as people tend to be more generous and forgiving and considerate to those for whom they feel positive emotions, and it can take time to cultivate this positive regard, but it's probably best to share these parts of yourself in an organic way sooner as opposed to later. It would be naive to argue that certain behaviors or attributes don't make men and women less attractive in the sexual marketplace. Since attractiveness is the particular form of power most relevant to the outcome of the negotiation phase of sexual relationships than hiding or intentionally lying to increase one's perceived attractiveness will, much like dating to cultivate a fantasy, likely contribute to the other party eventually feeling swindled by the transaction. This will significantly increase the chances they will jump ship or be thrown overboard. However, the good news is that no matter what it is that makes you feel less attractive and therefore prone to lie and hide, there are people in the world who don't care about that certain something and those who may even find it desirable. I guarantee it. They may not constitute the majority of people, but the majority of people won't ever be your customers, no matter what business you're running. In general, it's a better idea to be more attractive to a smaller subset of people than to be less attractive to a larger portion of the population. If you market yourself appropriately, then you will not only secure better terms for yourself more easily during the negotiation phase, but you will also retain your relationships with less effort and expense during the maintenance phase. Ultimately, those who neither date to cultivate a fantasy nor hide to avoid deal breakers are best positioned to successfully navigate the crisis of disillusionment, the danger within. Let's now move on to the second crisis. Chronologically speaking, it tends to occur sometime after the crisis of disillusionment, anywhere from 12 months to several years into a relationship, whereas the previous crisis is precipitated by a shattering of the fantasy cultivated by attraction. This crisis can only occur once a captain, This crisis can only occur once captains, who generally enter into the negotiation phase with a favorable power differential, have invested considerable resources into a given passenger. At this point, captains might be emotionally bonded or sexually monogamous or legally married, all of which tend to diminish the relative power of captains and increase the relative power of passengers. I'm genuinely tired and actually need this fucking coffee. At this point, captains must be emotionally bonded or sexually monogamous or legally married, all of which tend to diminish the relative power of captains and increase the relative power of passengers. This investment and the shifts in the power dynamic it inevitably produces sets the stage for the second crisis of the maintenance phase, the attempted mutiny. Not all passengers attempt a mutiny. However, the temptation to do so increases in all passengers as a function of captain's investment over time. Virtuous passengers of high moral character can resist this temptation for longer periods of time, but even these individuals become increasingly susceptible as conditions favorable to mutiny arise and persist. Indeed, given the various incentives in play, it can be the case that significantly more risk and effort are required not to mutiny than are needed to follow through on the attempt. Attempted mutinies typically occur when the ship has made substantial progress toward its intended destination and is well out of sight of land. Back at the docks, the captain set a course for the ship, which the passenger confirmed by examining the itinerary. Both parties seemed to be on the same page with respect to the journey's ultimate goal when the passenger climbed aboard, and the voyage may have progressed more or less smoothly up until this point. However, at some point the passenger will show up at the helm and inform the captain that he or she is no longer interested in sailing to the destination they agreed to back at the docks. The passenger would rather go somewhere else instead. Attempted mutinies are crises of power. Who is really in charge? Is the captain, who knows how to pilot the vessel, or is the passenger, who knows how to pilot the captain? Mutinies transpire in the middle of the ocean for obvious reasons. If passengers attempt their hijackings within sight of land, captains could just turn around and return their seditious cargo to the docks at little cost. Conversely, if passengers wait too long to initiate their coup, there might not be sufficient resources left to support a journey to the new destination, even if the mutiny comes off. As a result, these power grabs are most likely to occur when the ship is functionally equidistant from its point of origin, the initial destination, and the new proposed endpoint. That is, when it is just as costly to retreat to follow through as it is to alter course. In fact, the more passengers can insinuate that maintaining the initial course will be more expensive to captains than altering the destination, and the more likely passengers will be able to persuade captains to cede functional control of the helm. When we remember that every journey is composed of an infinite number of sub-journeys, much like a line is composed of an infinite number of points, we can appreciate that mutinies can occur at any scale of the endeavor, from the ultimate destination of the voyage, the ends, to the route by which they arrive at that destination, the means. When passengers suddenly confess that having children is actually very important to them and that they need a captain willing to start a family immediately, you have a mutiny at ends. On the other hand, when passengers become sulky or throw a tantrum every time captains go out with their friends, you have a mutiny of means. In any cases, in all cases, the principal mechanism of action is the same: to make non-compliance with the passenger's agenda significantly more costly to captains than compliance. And this is the main reason mutinies can only succeed after significant investment from captains. Without this buy-in, without an emotional bond or a financial entanglement or a functional dependence, most captains would simply cast passengers foolish enough to attempt a coup adrift in a dinghy. Mutinies succeed when captains believe that it is less costly for them to lose power and retain the passenger than it is for them to retain power and lose the passenger. This is why clever mutineers prefer to assume control of the ship by degrees rather than wrest control of the helm in a sudden, decisive action. When the cost to the captain of making a small deviation in course is dwarfed by the potential cost of the captain of losing the passenger in refusing to do so, then concession seems the rational course of action. Practically speaking, however, this reasoning is generally flawed, as a. Small changes can produce massive deviations over time, and b. Rewarding a behavior significantly increases the likelihood that it will recur in the future. When captains cater to their passengers' rebelliousness, they train their own mutineers. As stated previously, few passengers can entirely resist the urge to mutiny over a long enough timeline, especially when conditions are ripe for an attempt, as they are when, say, the captain is over-leveraged. This is because most people make decisions based on an often unconscious and an analysis of the various incentives under which they are operating, as opposed to recourse to a personally extrapolated moral or ethical code. Even relatively virtuous people can be corrupted for the right price. However, with this in mind, we can also anticipate that some passengers will be much more prone to mutiny than others. Perhaps counterintuitively, the distribution is bimodal. Passengers with few skills and resources are more likely to mutiny, and passengers with a great deal of skills and resources are also more likely to mutiny. Why might this be? Mutineers will always masquerade as legitimate passengers as long as the process of becoming a captain is costly and time consuming. Attaining a de facto captaincy by commandeering a vessel will always require fewer resources than building a ship, learning to sail, and plotting a course. In the fact, the tendency toward mutiny would likely prove universal in passengers, were it not for the substantial risk inherent in the attempt. This is why, much like real-life criminals of all stripes, passengers will be more disposed to mutiny the more they have to gain and the less they have to lose. This is why the distribution is bimodal. Passengers with few skills and resources are high risk because they may, realistically, despair of ever attaining a captaincy on their own merit or effort. They may lack the training and capacity to responsibly discharge that position, but that often doesn't stop them from wanting the status and prestige associated with the role. For such passengers, a successful mutiny has a nearly unlimited upside and a very attenuated downside. Captains generally seduce themselves into such a situation by focusing exclusively on the advantages of a widely disproportionate power differential, which are considerable. Unfortunately, this advantage becomes a liability once the differential crosses a certain threshold. A society of people with nothing to lose and everything to gain will be a perpetual risk of revolution. This is why prosperity is a government's best defense against rebellion. Even if life could be much better, people will find a way to endure when they believe they have more to lose than they have to gain. On the other hand, passengers with a great deal of skills and resources are also high risk because they are much more likely to fall prey to the corrosive force of envy. Envy is a complicated emotion. It can only manifest when there is a perceived deficiency in a personally relevant good with respect to a perceived equal. The more people believe themselves to be equals, the more likely they will perceive any variation in outcome to be unearned and unfair. With respect to our metaphor, this means that passengers who believe themselves to be the captain's equals will find it increasingly difficult to abide in an inferior role. Over time, they may come to resent the captain's authority and express this resentment in escalating displays of disrespect and insubordination. Such passengers are emboldened by the belief, appropriate or not, that they could always use their skills and resources to attain to their own captaincies should the mutiny attempt prove unsuccessful. As a result, like their more desperate counterparts, these passengers conclude that they have much to gain and little to lose. Captains are much more likely to find themselves in this situation the more they subscribe to the strict tenets of egalitarianism. Such an attitude towards relationships will may come with certain advantages, but one of its most glaring drawbacks is that it provides no rational basis for often necessary and justified distinctions in power and authority. And as might be expected, the more equal people are presumed to be, the smaller differences in outcome need to be to stimulate envy. When passengers believe themselves to be just as skilled and competent in the navigation of a ship as captains are, the less likely they will be to content themselves with a subordinate position over time. In any case, we can now appreciate that one of the best ways captains can defend themselves against an attempted mutiny is through careful passenger selection. As the saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If mutinies are more likely when the power differential is too big or too small, then they are least likely when the power differential is just right. That is, passengers should have enough skin in the game to fear the downside of an unsuccessful attempted mutiny, but not so much that they begrudge their inferior positions on board the ship. With this in mind, a 70 to 30 split in resource investment between captains and passengers is probably ideal to maintain stability. That said, Any passenger, even one carefully vetted by a captain, can attempt a mutiny when the conditions are sufficiently favorable. So, how should captains respond if and when this crisis occurs? In the vast majority of cases, the most appropriate response to an attempted mutiny is to call the bluff. While it might be painful for captains who have become emotionally attached or financially entangled to lose a particular passenger, it is generally much more devastating for a passenger to lose a particular captain. Sailing an understaffed ship is much less dangerous than being abandoned on a deserted island. A failed hijacking is even problematic for very attractive mutineers, while sufficiently attractive abandoned passengers might be able to flag down a passing ship and secure passage with a new captain, sometimes fairly quickly. They'll certainly have some explaining to do, and any captain worth his hard tack will take these passenger stories of being the innocent victims of cruel narcissists with a healthy dose of salt. An attractive passenger languishing on an uninhabited atoll is suspicious, to say the least, and these circumstances might compromise such a passenger's ability to secure a better arrangement moving forward. Most passengers are not shareholders in the venture. They don't own equity in the ship. The benefits they accrue depend on their continued attachment to the vessel. As a consequence, many passengers who have been jettisoned following an unsuccessful hijacking have nothing to show for their often considerable investment of time. If they choose to start over with a new captain, they potentially do so as older, less attractive versions of themselves, of course with a sufficiently lucrative severance package like those offered in many divorce settlements. This is much less of a deterrent for passengers. In fact, removing the painful consequences of a failed mutiny will significantly increase the likelihood that an attempt will occur at some point of the journey. This is why prudent captains not only vet their passengers carefully, but craft their agreements with all due caution as well. Losing a valued passenger can be bitter, but captains who are threatened with such a loss would do well to remember that it will likely be even more unpleasant for the passenger in question. What's more, small concessions designed to appease upstart passengers only reward rebellious behavior, functionally guaranteeing that captains will have to deal with more aggressive and frequent attempts in the future. In most cases, it will never be easier for captains to resist a hijacking and than it is today, with the amount of power they currently enjoy. For these reasons, it is typically the right move for captains facing an attempted mutiny to meet it head on. In general, the best way for captains to maintain their relationships is to persist in those behaviors that successfully attracted their partners down at the docks, regardless of how passengers might consciously feel those behaviors worked. Otherwise, they wouldn't be passengers on that particular captain's ship, whether or not they are aware of it. Passengers who pull off their mutinies typically only undermine their own rationale for choosing to board that particular vessel in the first place. This is why captains must also vigorously resist these attempts for the passengers' sake. If these captains allow their passengers to dictate the means of the ends, then the captains would be complicit in compromising passenger attraction, subverting the continued basis of the relationship. In the absence of interest or attraction, there is only obligation, and passengers are generally under less obligation than captains. obligation, untempered by positive emotionality, is very difficult for most people to maintain over time. So, it is important for captains to hold the line with their passengers, as passengers' continued commitment largely depends on their continued attraction. How do captains do this? Captains successfully squash attempted mutinies by aligning with the relationship. Responding with too much force or attacking the mutineering passenger directly will likely cultivate resentment and prove counterproductive in the long run. An effective response to an attempt could look like this. For the sake of our relationship, I can't give you control of the helm. If I allow you to dictate where we go and how we get there, then we're going to run ashore somewhere. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually, and that's because you don't know how to sail. I do. If you knew how to sail, you'd be your own captain. And if I didn't know what I was doing, you wouldn't be here. So for the sake of everyone's safety and well-being, I can't allow you to commandeer this vessel. And if that doesn't work for you, I'd be happy to leave you with a canteen of water on the next island we pass. Responding in this way will cause most passengers to back down. Once they surrender the attempt, it's important both to reward that behavior and to clarify future consequences. This could look like, I'm really happy that you've decided to continue on in the spirit in which we've been traveling. I'm glad that you're here, and I hope that we have many, many good years ahead of us. As long as we're together, I'll make sure that you're comfortable and well provided for. And if you ever try something like that again, I'll cast you adrift in a rowboat. There will be no discussion and no questions asked. Do you understand? Don't ever do that again. This is a 30-second conversation. It's possible to move forward from here because it's not important whether captains trust that passengers won't attempt another mutiny in the future. It's only necessary that passengers trust captains will implement the stated consequence. If the consequence is sufficiently aversive to passengers and their best interests, they will find a way to keep themselves in line, one way or another. If done correctly, captains should only ever have to put down an attempted mutiny once. Repeated attempts suggest the captains have bungled their responses. A dead calm. We now come to the third crisis. Chronologically, it occurs even later than an attempted mutiny, generally many years into a relationship. Unlike the other two, this crisis won't feel like a crisis. There is no sudden or jarring precipitating event. This crisis overtakes the vessel slowly and gradually over time. It often begins imperceptibly and proceeds by such fine degrees that many don't even realize it's occurring until it's too late. This is the crisis of the doldrums, and it affects all relationships over a long enough timeline. In the real world, the doldrums are a region around the equator where trade winds converge and cancel each other out, creating a perpetual calm. However, in our metaphor, the doldrums are the period in a relationship characterized by a significant decrease in passion and sexual intimacy. Like their real-world counterparts, these doldrums might be stable, even tranquil, but they can also be monotonous and suffocating. Like so many other aspects of relationships, it's not possible for two people to want sex at exactly the same frequency. One person will want sex more often, and the other will want it less. How this crisis is experienced largely depends on where one is situated in this libido imbalance. What may be serene for the partner with the lower libido might be agonizing for the other. Furthermore, whether this crisis can be resolved depends on the size of the imbalance. The larger the gap in libidos, the more difficult it is to work it out. Couples in the doldrums are functionally roommates. They may feel a good deal of respect and appreciation, even love for each other, but the sexual dimension of their relationship may have disappeared long ago. This can be dangerous, as it leads to either A. a complacency in which one or both parties stop growing and settle into comfort, or B. a sublimation of the libido, most often into work or children, that takes one or both parties further and further away from the primary relationship. Neither of these solutions is ideal, and few people would consciously strive for such an end. In fact, many people understandably shudder at the prospect of ending up involuntarily celibate in a monogamous relationship. However, if no one seems to want this outcome, why do so many people end up here? To answer this, it's important to understand that sex is about a lot more than just pleasure and reproduction. It serves many different functions in a given relationship, and the more sex remains necessary, that is, the more functions it actually serves, the more likely a relationship will remain sexually active. One primary function of sex is a relationship is to One primary function of sex in a relationship is to create and maintain emotional bonding. On a psychological level, this occurs because certain sexual behaviors are predictably associated with the release and circulation of oxytocin, a hormone that facilitates the formation of emotional attachment. In general, the higher the oxytocin levels, the stronger the emotional bond. This, in large part, explains why sex is generally so hot and heavy early in the courtship process. At this stage of the relationship, neither party has a legitimate claim on the other, and either person could suddenly disappear with little consequence. However, a partner is much more likely to return for a repeat performance if there is an emotional bond. This is why people typically throw as much sex as possible at those they're interested in seeing again. Whether or not they're aware of it, sex is their way of saying, I want you to come back. This strategy tends to work because more sex generally means more oxytocin. More oxytocin generally means a stronger emotional bond, and a stronger emotional bond generally means more frequent interaction. This is pretty much true for everyone. However, women, who typically have much higher levels of circulating oxytocin than men, tend to bond faster than men. For better or worse, men are able to compartmentalize sex and emotional connection more effectively than women. That said, even master compartmentalizers aren't immune. With enough interaction, they'll eventually get there too. However, with time and repetition, the emotional dynamic within the couple begins to transform. Elusiveness and indifference give way to consistency and commitment. No one wonders whether the other is going to come back. If anything, each might now be wondering if the other is ever going to leave. In any case, the emotional bond has become firmly established. No one is going anywhere, and to the extent that the other becomes a sure thing, sex, with its ability to facilitate emotional bonding, becomes increasingly unnecessary and irrelevant. Why tie someone up who isn't planning to move anyway? This is one of the main reasons why sex becomes more infrequent in relationships as a function of time. When it comes to people, it turns out that there are no true solutions, only trade-offs. And while most of the ideals that couples intentionally strive for, like commitment and closeness and communication, might solve some problems, they absolutely create others. That said, many people don't know they have a choice about which suit of problems might be more tolerable for them to hear. This lack of awareness is due to our cultural template for long-term heterosexual relationships that, despite all our modern ideas and values, remains extremely monolithic and inflexible. The goal of mature relationships is to settle down. This is how a school mom reprimands her rambunctious students. No more freedom, no more excitement, no more movement. It's time to leave those days behind and become a consistent source of productivity and sacrifice for your family. After all, foregoing your own purpose and happiness for the sake of your partner and children is one of the greatest gifts a person could possibly offer in this lifetime. Did you expect this to be all fun and games? Serious relationships take work. Aren't aren't you a little old to be thinking with that part of your anatomy anyway? We can talk about this in couples therapy next week. In the meantime, what do you think of this interest rate for the loan we need for our kitchen remodel? I think we should make a decision soon because I hear that granite is getting harder to come by. For better or worse, our culture's relationships construct has been optimized for security and generativity. The ideal marriage in the collective imagination is a Borgias melange, of suburban prosperity, evidence-based parenting, and Protestant work ethic. And when the end goal of this ideal is the chaste, there's way too many retarded words in this that make no fucking sense to my dyslexic mind. Compassionate togetherness, companionate togetherness, epitomized by a sweet old couple holding hands in their respective rocking chairs. Is it really a surprise that marriages turn sexless over time? Gross. The same structures and behaviors that are conducive to stability and commitment are simultaneously detrimental to passion and sexuality. You can't have it both ways. Where the former are, the latter are not. Maximizing the one functionally minimizes the other. This understanding is particularly relevant for men, who trade resources for sexual opportunity in the sexual marketplace. While few men would prefer to be in sexless relationships, men who find themselves in such situations tend to feel cheated and swindled. Such men provide more commitment and more resources over time, only to discover that they are recompensed with less enthusiastic and less frequent sex. They feel punished for doing the right thing, which is a surefire way to generate resentment. Unfortunately, many of these men never learn the extent to which they were complicit in cultivating this predicament. The truth is that their relationships aren't sexless in spite of their efforts, they're sexless in large part because of them. So how can folks successfully escape the doldrums? Like so many other issues that are subject to arising in relationships, this can be most easily accomplished through prevention. Selecting partners with a deep and abiding commitment to growth and self-development will reduce the likelihood that they will fall prey to the trap of complacency, and secure and independent partners are more likely to have their own lives and less likely to feel threatened by your autonomy. These qualities should make them better able to tolerate the separateness and uncertainty conducive to a robust sex life. There are also many practical methods to resuscitate a moribund boudoir. However, given what we now understand about trade-offs, we can expect these methods to look very different from those the popular imagination believes to be associated with relationship success, and which may in reality be more conducive to security than relationships than sexuality. For instance, one of the best ways to stimulate passion in a long-term relationship is to act as though you were having an affair. Let's briefly consider why this works, as it will help to elucidate the mechanisms by which desire tends to operate. What would it look like if you were actually having an affair? Well, you would likely become much less available. You would be spending more time out of the house, doing things you don't ordinarily do and going places you don't ordinarily go. You would probably become less communicative as well. After all, you wouldn't pick up the phone if you were with your lover when your partner called, and you would likely take longer to respond to texts if your hands were otherwise full. Perhaps your fling would motivate you to pay more attention to your appearance. You might start dressing a little nicer, or putting more effort into maintaining your figure. Perhaps the spring would return to your step, or the sparkle to your eye. Of course, you wouldn't tell your partner about your little tryst. This means you will have succeeded in carving out a part of your life to which your partner has no access, a part just for you, and while it may be wrong to admit it, the fact that you shouldn't be stepping out of your relationship makes it all the more desirable. After all, there's nothing quite tempting as the taste of forbidden fruit. And finally, since you would be getting your sexual needs met elsewhere, there would be little reason to seek satisfaction from your partner. So, you would likely stop pursuing sex in your primary relationship, who needs more rejection and frustration, and you would feel increasingly unconcerned about your partner's disinterest. That said, if you were to do all these things, your partner would likely not remain as indifferent as he or she once was. The deviations in your behavior will not have escaped this person's attention, and these changes will have aroused his or her curiosity. And since you were probably not as smooth as you believed yourself to be in executing the affair, this curiosity might have noticed something: a stray hair, an unfamiliar phone number. The shadow of the other now lurks on the fringes just out of sight, threatening the comfortable security of the primary relationship. Is he going to leave me? What if she doesn't come back? The upshot of all this sneaking around is that, perhaps for the first time in a long time, the relationship will have come to approximate the conditions that organically existed during the courtship process, characterized by the most frequent and passionate sexuality. And the good news is that the actual infidelity is not necessary, is everything that comes with the infidelity that is conducive to the cultivation of desire. And what does the infidelity come with? More time apart, less communication, more spontaneity, less transparency, more mystery, less certainty, more attention to one's appearance, less pressure to have sex in the primary relationship, more risk and uncertainty, less security and predictability, more competition, less coziness, more danger, less safety, more me, less us. None of these require an extramarital affair. They just tend to come with the territory. That said, if you choose not to have an affair, then you must also choose to consciously resist the constant social pressure to prioritize relationship stability above all things. At least if you want to keep the passion alive in your bedroom and beyond. Separation, in all its forms, is non-negotiable. For your partner to miss you, you first have to leave. After all, there is no need to use intimacy to reconnect with you if you never disengage from your partner to begin with. For your partner to wonder about you, you first have to be unknown. People will ruminate on a riddle for weeks, and next think of it again once they consider the solution, discover the solution. To the extent that you are a completely known entity, a condition you cultivate with constant communication, there is no rational basis to attend to you. Without attention, there can be no curiosity. Without curiosity, there can be no interest. Without interest, there can be no attraction. And without attraction, there can be no desire. If you want to keep the desire alive in your relationship, then you need to protect the upstream sources of desire that feed into that outcome. Though we often don't like to admit it, it is the threat of loss, more than anything else, that motivates people to make a continual effort. To be sure, too much of a threat can be terrifying and paralyzing. It is not conducive to action. However, most committed relationships suffer from too little threat as opposed to too much. The ability to remove people from their positions as a consequence of incompetence, abuse, or neglect is the only real accountability that exists in this world. Throughout history, the greatest corruptions of power have been perpetrated by those who, for whatever reason, did not fear they could ever be dismayed. The threat of loss, a real loss that does not offer a soft landing, irrespective of performance, is generally necessary to keep people on the straight and narrow and to insensitize their consistent best efforts. I'm going to stick to the book, I'm going to stick to the script, and I'm not going to share my views and potential disagreements. I'm just going to say again, disclaimer, there's some pretty extreme stuff in this. I don't agree with everything, but I'm also here just to share this perspective with you. So, let me continue. Almost done. I know we've gone past an hour. Got 2 pages left, or 1.5. Nurturing the conditions known to stimulate desire is necessary to escape the doldrums, and one of the best ways to do that is to work to retain at least some of the circumstances that existed down at the dock back when the initial attraction was first ignited. Captains should continue to take the actions that succeeded in attracting passengers onto their ships. Passengers should continue to behave as they did when captains were enthusiastic about having them on board. Neither can relax too much in the performance of their roles. By cultivating an appreciation for the components of desire, the individuals involved might be able to generate enough movement to break free of the stultifying calm and continue on their journey. In this chapter, I turned my attention to the third phase that constitutes all relationships, the maintenance phase. In particular, I examined three of the most significant crises that are subject to occurring once a ship sets sail. In the crisis of disillusionment, individuals must decide to whom they are more attracted, their actual partners or their own projected fantasies. Further out at sea, the second crisis, an attempted mutiny, forces both parties to come to terms with issues related to power and frame. Finally, the couple must eventually escape the unwavering doldrums, the third maintenance crisis, by nurturing sufficient desire to propagate forward motion. Those who successfully navigate these three crises, either through prudence or cunning, may arrive to enjoy the best that relationships have to offer and a sustained and mutually satisfying intimacy. Having now discussed all three relationship phases in some detail, we will increasingly abstract from the individual dynamics in which relationships transpire to the larger social and cultural context in which they occur. I'll begin by responding to the most common criticism of my economic model of relationships, the love exception. If you'd like to further explore the topics presented in this chapter, please click on the link below to access a curated playlist on the PsychHacks channel on YouTube. Shout out to Dr. Orion Taraban for this book. This is his work, not mine. Thanks for tuning in and listening all the way through. We're going to be reading a chapter a day until it's complete. Next up is chapter 9, and I believe this book is made up of 12 chapters, so that will be 4 more parts, potentially 5 if we are kind of rounding it off with the and there's a very brief epilogue, and the acknowledgements, which are just a few pages, I think. So yeah, 4 more videos, 4 more chapters. I was cutting them into halves, but I'm gonna smash them out because I want to get onto a book on Stoicism, but I'm also planning a digital detox, and I want to complete this book before disappearing offline for days, so I don't, have a big gap. So I want to complete this one, and then I'll take a break from YouTube for a little while, and then I'll be coming back with fucking Stoicism for sure this time. It's pretty based, pretty good philosophy. Cigar a day keeps the doctor away. Coffee a day attempts to keep the tiredness at bay. Definitely going to need another one of them today. I've got quite a lot of stuff to get on with. Fucking hell. And if you would like a sheep skull sourced from the mountainous regions of Wales, then check out the link below for my Etsy shop where I sell various animal skulls and bones, included but not limited to sheep, ponies, squirrels, badgers, etc., etc. God bless you. See you next time. Peace out.